Welcome, guys. So, as Claire introduced me, I'm Jodie Cahill, and I'm a homeopathic and naturopathic physician. I actually saw Claire Terry as a patient, and we got chatting as one does in the consult. And she asked me to come and have a chat with you. So normally I teach nutrition, but in nutrition I don't really teach homeopathy, which is kind of ironic being a homeopath. But I teach nutrition, I teach biomedicine. So my background is more kind of a sciencey type background. But to be fair, I didn't have a clue what osteopathy was really all about. Yeah, back home in South Africa, we don't really have osteopaths. Those osteopaths we do have kind of come down from the UK, really. We have chiropractors, which are a bit more hardcore compared to you guys. Yeah, you're a bit more gentle, a bit more kind of, kind. Yes? Sometimes. But you're definitely very gentle with me. Good. But, so my background was just, I didn't really have a clue what the heck I was going to chat to you guys about. So I'm like, I don't really know what to talk about. Muscles, bones, what else do I chat to osteopaths about? And so when we got chatting or thinking about what kind of topic we could do, I thought, well, what are most complementary therapists seeing in clinic? And generally it was inflammation, right? I mean, I don't know, what do you guys do in terms of managing patients, particularly with chronic inflammation? I assume acute inflammation is more kind of cryotherapy and perhaps a bit of rest. Yeah, the standard kind of rice approach. Yeah, what do you do for chronic inflammation? Do you just hope for the best that it will subside in time?
Oh, you look at what's causing it. Yeah.
Okay. So you investigate the cause. Turmeric teas. Okay. That's really nice and herby. Anything else? I believe too you don't run blood tests. You don't. Do you check for ESR and CRP or look at those? Nothing. Okay. I am going to kind of
refer them back to the GP.
You refer to the GP and get those results. So when you look at the cause, is that from a structural perspective? You're looking at the structural issue of what's causing the chronic inflammation.
And nutrition.
Diet.
And a bit of nutrition and diet too.
Absolutely. Well,
Oh, brilliant. Brilliant. Okay. So I guess there's a bit of an all-rounder. Yeah. Some people use nutrition already. Some people don't. Okay.
Technically, it's a holistic approach, so you're looking at everything.
Yeah.
Rather than trying to isolate a muscle or a bone,
Yes.
you're looking at the whole system and going, why?
Yeah.
Rather than trying to pick out that one minute thing.
Yeah.
Which is
Okay.
a chiropractic approach.
Yes. Yes. Exactly. It's very kind of more an allopathic mindset, really. Okay. So let's go through. I came across a couple of bits. Of course, when you classify something as being chronic, it's generally if it's been standing for longer than 3 months. That's the kind of standard definition of defining something as being acute or chronic. What I thought was quite interesting here, just reflecting on pain and the experience of pain. 7.9 million UK individuals are suffering from moderate to severe pain, right? Which is quite remarkable when you think of, I mean, that's a hell of a lot of sick people going around, right? A hell of a lot of people who are in pain walking around, and you've got loads of potential income there, right? Yes? Anyway, by the by, moderate to severe debilitation. These individuals hopefully are seeing someone to be managed, so probably a lot of them are on steroid medication, right? Some of them, I don't know, do you guys encounter many patients on methotrexate while they're undergoing treatment with you? Mm-hmm. So a lot of these, it generally tends to kind of make it quite difficult with what we can potentially use sometimes, when there are a lot, particularly on things like methotrexate or infliximab, anything that we start kind of influencing, particularly liver function, right? So we don't want to kind of bombard the system with too much. So what about the other percentage of the population where we have chronic kind of low-grade inflammation? So they may not have any obvious signs that there's trauma or tissue damage going on, but actually long-term, 20, 30 years down the line, we actually now have degrees of fibrosis that's starting to develop. So these ones often go under the radar, right? Because when you do blood tests, how do we detect that there's inflammation going on? Chronic low-grade inflammation is not going to be detected with your standard ESR and CRP. Okay, so I wanted to kind of introduce that because I think there's a massive potential for us approaching inflammation from an aspect of, doesn't necessarily mean that a patient has to be presenting with pain, for us to have a more kind of holistic anti-inflammatory type approach. Okay, so in terms of causes of chronic inflammation, I thought we could touch on a kind of key aspects. I'm not going to be discussing all of them during the talk, because of course we could be here for a couple of days. Yeah. But from an infective aspect, I'm sure you guys have probably encountered a lot of papers looking at EBV being linked with RA, with rheumatoid arthritis. There's lots of kind of potential exposure to antigens in terms of EBV antigens and perhaps inciting an RA type picture. So when we look at infections, remember a lot of these microbes are intracellular. So EBV, measles, herpes, Borrelia. Borrelia is also a hot topic. Yeah, I don't know if you guys have also seen it within osteopathy, but definitely in nutrition, definitely in naturopathy. It seems that Lyme is a topic that's being discussed quite extensively, right? But Borrelia too is another intracellular microbe. And when we talk about intracellular microbes, we're talking about here about a microorganism that hides, that goes under the radar, kind of like a Trojan horse. And when it goes like under the radar like a Trojan horse, it hides within our cells. And so we may not always have patients presenting with glandular fever or with overt Lyme picture, right? But they may have a very insidious kind of chronic low-grade inflammation that's giving us an indication that there's something going on. You with me? And for many of them, when they check for the antigens, or not rather the antigens, but rather the antibodies, we're not seeing any kind of positive screening for the antibodies. So again, they slip under the radar. And so what I'm suggesting is that for many of these, when you start looking at geographical locations, when you start looking at potentially family histories, you can start kind of gathering a picture as to the likelihood of them having these intracellular microbes. And to be fair, most of us have all got HPV, and most of us have probably all got herpes. Being intracellular, if they get into a gamete, offspring will contract that intracellular microbe. So we can have generational, so we can have children now born with an EBV virus, but they've never had glandular fever. You with me? Okay, so it's a massive issue in terms of intracellular infections. And one of my approaches, and I'm probably going to be put on a stake or stoned at some point, but I do wonder, are these infections something that is worth treating? Are we ever going to get rid of them? Or are we looking at a way in which we can kind of adapt to them? So when we look at pathology, when we look at disease, when we look at inflammation, are these just mechanisms of adaptation? And is it our failure to adapt that's causing the pathology? You with me? So in time, perhaps maybe 100 years, 200 years, maybe 500 years' time, these will be illnesses that just won't be an issue for us because we would have eventually been able to evolve or adapt to them. Okay, so that's one aspect, the infection. When it comes to candida, I don't know if you guys encounter this a lot, but loads of naturopaths, nutritionists like to kind of diagnose everyone with candida. Yeah, and the reality is we all have candida, right? Every single one of us, it grows on us all the time. But what we're looking at here is when we have a systemic candida infection. And in most cases, to be fair, guys, you're not going to see systemic candida infections unless you've got someone who's on a systemic steroid, or you've got someone who has AIDS, an acquired immunodeficiency state, someone who's severely immunocompromised because of chemo drugs or radiation. The kind of standard, do we have a systemic candida infection, is relatively rare, right? What they're looking at here is candida overgrowth perhaps causing a dysbiosis? Is it disrupting perhaps the internal ecology? So it's not quite classed as a systemic infection, but it's disrupting our normal flora. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about probiotics. I don't know how much you guys know of probiotics. Okay. The other aspect is prolonged exposure to inflammatory cytokines. Now, of course, there's loads of mediators for inflammation. And again, obviously, this is just the tip of the iceberg. There's, of course, a lot that we don't know about the immune system, about how inflammation works, about the various different pathways, which is why we still don't bloody well know what to do with it other than give steroids or immunosuppressants. Right? That's the kind of complex approach of dealing with things. So when we look at the different cytokines and chemokines, I'm going to focus on primarily interleukin 1, interleukin 6, and TNF. I may bring up the MMP, but this generally you don't tend to kind of encounter too much with much of what I'm talking about here. It's a little bit more detailed, so I'll just kind of suss out how we go. In terms of Th1 and Th2, do you guys also encounter this at all, discuss it at all? Because I'm just trying to gauge how much information I need to be talking about if I'm totally boring you. Okay, well when we look at Th1 and Th2, these are T helper cells. So when we are exposed to an antigen, the immune system creates antibodies, yeah, in order to kind of attack these foreign antigens. Now, when we look at Th1 mediated immune responses, these are normally responses that are associated with either viral infections or bacterial infections, foreign antigens. You see it also rampant within cancers, yeah, the Th1 response, autoimmunity. Autoimmune pathway, so if you're looking at rheumatoid arthritis or you're looking at lupus, it's typically driven down this Th1 mediated immune response, right? When you look at Th2, you normally find T helper 2 cells are driving the allergy type responses. So when you're looking at things like asthma and eczema, again, I don't know how much you see of eczema and asthma, I don't know what you can do with them, but you may have a patient who's coming to you for lower back pain and yet they're also presenting with asthma, right? So it's something to kind of bear in mind because again, you're looking holistically at the individual. So that's something to bear in mind. There are certain supplements, certain herbs that may dampen down situations where you've got an excessive drive in a Th1 or an excessive drive in a Th2. So that you can kind of, in clinic, just recommending certain foods or certain supplements that can buy over the counter that can help kind of modulate these responses. In a healthy individual, we should have a bit of a kind of seesawing effect going on. We should have a bit of both. But of course, when we have pathology, when we have a hypersensitive immune response or we have an autoimmune cascade, they're being dominated in one particular pathway rather than modulating. That makes sense? Okay, so I'll touch on that too. When we also look at interleukin 17, now interleukin 17 also you don't encounter it too much in terms of what I'm talking about, the kind of low-grade chronic inflammation. It's normally involved in more acute inflammatory responses. But I thought I'd bring it up because with interleukin 7, you find that when acute inflammatory responses aren't being dealt with, particularly with viral infections or bacterial infections or even parasitic infections, the Th17 helper cells, these can continue to drive from acute into a chronic type picture. So I'm going to kind of explore what can we do about these if this may be the issue. Arachidonic acid, this is kind of old stuff. We know arachidonic acid drives the COX-2 pathway, it promotes prostaglandin 2 production, which also kind of drives, pro-inflammatory chemicals. So when we talk about arachidonic acid, I don't know if you guys are familiar with good old Patrick Holford at all. Yeah, wrote loads of books, made lots of money. No? Okay. Well, anyway, he was a huge kind of advocate for this arachidonic acid, and it's all very bad, and it's being driven because we have too much food produce that's laden with omega-6, and much of the omega-6 that we're ingesting is all hydrogenated and pro-inflammatory. It's all very, very bad. Yeah? So this is where margarines, the kind of standard, lovely flora with some beta-sinosterols, all good for you. Load of crap. It's not good for you at all, right? The good old-fashioned saturated lard, ghee, these kind of things are better for you. Are you going to burn yet? No? Okay, good. The other one is heterocyclic amines. Now, these you're going to be exposed to a lot when people are doing things like frying, when they are grilling foods, barbecuing. I don't know how many barbecues you guys do here, but barbecuing of produce. The proteins end up denaturing and they produce these heterocyclic amines, and these again are massive mediators of inflammation. So you could have someone again who may not be presenting with specific joint pain, or maybe they've got a little bit of muscle tightness, but actually when you have a chat about what are they eating, what are their dietary intake, you need to kind of then appreciate, well, if they, how do they cook their food? If they say they have a steak 3 times a week or 4 times a week, well, how are they preparing that steak? In addition to that, are there other bits? Are they whacking on dollops of, flora margarine is supposed to be good for them? So it's trying to take the whole kind of dietary intake into account. Histamine's another big one. Now, I don't know if you've encountered histodilacs, but histodilacs are individuals who constitutionally are quite sensitive. They overproduce histamine. So you tend to find in these constitutions, they tend to exhibit within their family line, within their family history, lots of histamine production. So there's lots of eczemas, lots of asthmas within the family. You may also find that there tends to be also hyperactivity. So histamine is also a neurotransmitter in the brain, and it kind of drives activity. I mean, it's good to a degree. It helps us concentrate. So hopefully you guys got some histamine pumping through your brains. But histamine is good in terms of allows us to cement inflammation short term, particularly. But if we have too much, obviously this drives a hyperactive type state. So we're looking at it also in children who perhaps exhibit things like ADD, ADHD, and possibly, I think more research needs to be invested into it, in terms of the autistic spectrum. Looking again, is there some kind of constitutional histamine prevalence within these individuals? Okay. And histamine, remember, comes from mast cells. So it's looking at, can we stabilize mast cells? And there's quite a lot of things, actually, that we can use to stabilize mast cells to reduce the likelihood of them degranulating. Okay, so we'll explore that too. The next one, homocysteine. Homocysteine, I'm sure also you probably encountered. It's one of the chemicals that are produced by a number of different pathways in the body, but it typically is quite a good indicator of cardiovascular disease and also cerebrovascular disease, so things like your Alzheimer's and dementias and your stroke risk. So it's one of these tests that's pretty reasonably priced. I think it's about £55, yeah, to do it privately. And yeah, it's pretty well managed. So if you get individuals onto a good kind of B complex with a little trimethylglycine, TMG, I know High Nature do a lovely H factors combo that approaches homocysteine. So if you know there's family histories of high homocysteine, you'll follow this if there's a high cardiovascular risk within the family or high cerebrovascular risk in the family. But again, this is one of these chemicals that are going to be driving the inflammatory process. So there's quite a lot here, and again, as I've said, I've only just touched the tip of the iceberg in terms of looking at what promotes inflammation. So when you've got someone in front of you that has chronic inflammation, it's a bit of a minefield. But thankfully, hopefully with some of the supplements that I'm going to recommend, or some of the herbs and some of the homeopathy, hopefully this will cover most of those bases. Because what you'll find with many of these mediators, particularly within the family of the interleukins, there's a lot of interleukins that, although we release some that are pro-inflammatory, at the same time we have some anti-inflammatory ones too. Because we constantly have this desire to modulate, to reach homeostasis. So we'll never want to always drive inflammation. We'll always want to try and kind of dampen it if it's unnecessary. What I do want to pose to you again is looking at and always appreciating, is inflammation something that we really want to remove totally? And so you may kind of go, well, yeah, why not? You know, if it's causing tissue damage, why not? But again, I want to kind of remind you that when we have inflammation is like a stressor on the system. And when we have a stressor, stress causes change. Right? When we look at animals, unless they have stress in their environment, they will not evolve. So I'm going to pose again, is chronic inflammation something that we need to treat and stop, or is it something that we just need to kind of manage and be aware of within the patient and observe how is it influencing their daily activity? Okay. And then lastly, with autoimmunity, as I've mentioned, it's Th1 driven, so we'll look at what kind of things we can do to help kind of dampen down the Th1 dominance. And then lastly, stress. I mean, stress is a massive topic, right? Everyone's stressed, constantly, yeah? And it doesn't, remember that as a system, as a host, we don't really care whether it's emotional stress, whether it's a physical stress. The body perceives the stressor in pretty much the same way, right? We still have an adrenaline and cortisol-based response. So when we appreciate how stress impacts on the body, we're going to see how this has a knock-on effect with a number of antibody production. Okay, so I'm going to talk about secretory IgA quite a lot, yeah, with the stress. Any questions so far? No? I would just want, going back to the arachidonic acid one, I'm not going to be giving too many pictures on pathways and whatnot. I don't want to kind of freak you out unnecessarily, because again, I don't quite know how far I need to go into detail. But arachidonic acid, this is good, yes, this is bad. When we look at the kind of COX-2 pathway, this is where we're producing lots and lots of pro-inflammatory cytokines. But what I want to draw to your attention on the image is, notice here interleukin-1 is a mediator, or stimulator rather, of the conversion of arachidonic acid and the stimulus to COX-2. So what I'm trying to get at here is that arachidonic isn't all that bad. It depends what other players are working alongside it. If you don't have the interleukin-1, then you're likely not going to be driving that pro-inflammatory process. The kind of things where you may have an increase in interleukin are things like high sugar in the diet. When we have high glycemic loads, yeah, this will drive an interleukin-1 production. So what I'm getting at here, guys, is we could have lots of arachidonic acid in our diet. Eating red meat, animals produce arachidonic acid. But just because they have it, just because we ingest it, doesn't mean it's necessarily always going to be pro-inflammatory. Yeah? Sometimes it can go down the COX-1 pathway. What I'm saying is here, you need a number of different intermediaries. You need a number of different kind of fertilizers, so to speak, to kind of drive these processes. Okay. In terms of looking at the consequences of inflammation, I'm sure most of us are aware of this anyway, so the chronic pain is one aspect, and with chronic pain, with the use of things like beta endorphins to kind of modulate or help with coping with pain, we then have a depreciation of serotonin, yeah, because they're very closely linked. Beta endorphins change into serotonin, which changes into melatonin. So the whole kind of triad of pain and chronic pain, we have depression, we have insomnia, okay. Which is just a self-perpetuating cycle, right? Because the more pain we have, the less we sleep, the more depressed we get. The more depressed we get, the less we sleep, the more pain we get. It just kind of feeds into itself. Okay, so at some point we need to kind of stop that pathway. When we look at fibrosis, I'm sure you guys can encounter this frequently. Fibrosis doesn't necessarily mean that you've surrendered that part non-functional, but sometimes it depends on the percentage, right, of fibrosis development within the tissue. I don't know how you guys encounter it in terms of breaking down fibrosis, but I believe kind of physios and chiropractors normally use massage to manually break down fibrosis of fibrotic tissue. But again, it's incredibly stubborn, right? And again, you need to have a look at what is the underlying cause, what is driving that fibrotic tissue development. In addition to that, when we look at fibrosis, there are certain kinds of proteolytic enzymes which can be quite useful in clinic, which again you can kind of buy over the counter. I haven't treated many fibrosis patients in terms of musculature, but most certainly in terms of liver cirrhosis, which is termed irreversible, right? Definitively it's supposed to be an irreversible condition. However, a couple of years ago I remember having a patient who came to me with liver cirrhosis as a result of Hep C. And I said to him, look, you know, your liver is 70% cirrhosis, there's nothing I can do about it, it's irreversible. And anyway, we ended up treating, because he had a whole host of issues, we ended up treating all the other issues, and I had him on a whole bunch of herbs and homeopathy and supplements, which we changed and rotated over a period of 2 years. And after this 2-year period, he was due to kind of go back to, he was going to do a study in Oxford of a new drug to help with the Hep C and the fibrosis. And anyway, once he was supposed to be entering into the study, they reassessed the fibrosis, and there was nothing. And of course, I was completely floored, because I was like, what, this is impossible, surely not. In my naivety, was that actually if you provide the body with the right tools and resources, and you regulate everything else, it knows in its infinite wisdom what it needs to do, and how it needs to correct tissue function. Right? So I thought that was quite remarkable. And one of the substances that I used was serrapeptase. I don't know if you've come across the enzyme serrapeptase. Serrapeptase, I'll have done here. And you can buy it over the counter. Normally they start, I prefer to start patients on 50,000 IUs, but you can take it up to 80,000 and 100,000. What it is, it's a proteolytic enzyme, so it breaks down proteins, right? But you need to be cautious if you have someone who perhaps has gastritis or they've got peptic ulcers, well then you need to be quite cautious with them, because of course they're going to start digesting themselves. So you do need to, I think it's safer to start with the 50, see how they manage it, and then slowly over a number of weeks to months you can slowly start increasing it up to about 100. Yeah? And the idea, again, is just that in the body's wisdom it knows where to mobilize serrapeptase, it knows where to take it, and seems to kind of break down fibrotic tissue. They're applying it, they're doing lots of studies of looking at it with atherosclerotic plaques. So to try and get the people to avoid things like coronary bypasses, can they get them onto enough serrapeptase to try and kind of facilitate removal of atherosclerosis? So I thought that was quite interesting. All right, and then lastly, the loss of motor function, which hopefully they're not coming to see you at the time of loss of motor function. Hopefully it's a bit prior to the fibrosis. Right? And another couple of aspects which I thought I'd throw in there, because they're not ones that we generally think, oh, is associated with inflammation, or chronic inflammation at least, but things like angiogenesis. So angiogenesis, the creation of new blood vessels, yeah, where we know we can kind of force or facilitate, provided the right amount of stress on an organ, we can facilitate or grow new blood vessels to supply that tissue. Now, areas like the brain, areas like the liver can undergo angiogenesis quite readily, right, if it has enough of a stressor, which is again kind of driving the force. Stress is a good thing, it's not always a bad thing, right? But with angiogenesis, we need to be quite cautious, particularly with the realm of oncology, so with the cancer stuff. So this is why, there's lots of talk with cancer. Inflammation promotes cancer. Inflammation causes cancer. Once someone gets into the pathway of being treated with the drugs of cancer, it just perpetuates that very inflammatory environment. Okay. Hypercholesterolemia, hyperlipidemia, hypertriglyceridemia. All of these, when we have increased lipid production, it's merely a response of the liver to try and upregulate a tool that we can use to try and plaster on damaged tissue. Yeah, we know well that when we have lots of inflammation in the body and we damage the endothelial lining of blood vessels, we use LDL cholesterol as a plaster. It's a kind of like a little sealant, right? But without that inflammation, LDL would not precipitate out and would not attach to the endothelial lining. So we kind of need to look at, when it comes to things like hypercholesterolemia, was the issue with the cholesterol, or did the issue start actually prior to the cholesterol? Did the issue start because there was inflammation somewhere in the body, that the body felt the need to then upregulate cholesterol production? Does that make sense? Atherosclerosis ties into the hypercholesterolemia. I've already mentioned that one. In terms of diabetes, we know that many of the cytokines, particularly interleukin 1 and interleukin 6, it starts interfering with the signal transduction of insulin when it binds to the receptor site. So it starts interfering with how insulin binds to insulin receptors. And so when we know that we have pro-inflammatory processes going on, this hugely disrupts the way in which the body can utilize both insulin and thus they utilize glucose. And when we don't take glucose into a cell, the mitochondria scream out for more. They say, well, I'm trying to do my work, but I'm not getting any glucose. And so the cells scream out as though they're suffering from hypoglycemia, right? Despite the fact that the patient's in a state of hyperglycemia. And so this continues to drive further insulin production. They then get hyperinsulinemia, and this is your typical stage 2 diabetes. And it's an interesting one, because when you look at adipose tissue, I mentioned on the previous slide something called leptins. Leptins as well as lectins, they're different molecules. Leptins regulates appetite, lectins have a role to play in inflammation, but both of these have a huge role to play with in terms of diabetes and how we deposit fat. And once we start depositing adipose tissue, it kind of self-perpetuates, right? So the more adipose we have, the more pro-inflammatory cytokines we release, the more adipose we lay down. When we think of fat, most of us think of fat, it's an insulator, right? It protects us. Why do we put it around our midriff area? Because we have no skeletal structure, right, around the midriff. Yes, we've got musculature, but in order to kind of protect us and provide a bit of a cushion, well, we have lovely cortisol receptors, all on our greater omentum, all with an affinity to lay down adipose. So when we have high cortisol levels, rather than lay down fat on our legs and our arms, we take the fat away from our legs and arms and we move it to the midriff. These are all because of inflammatory cytokines. Again, cortisol is one of them, one of the mediators of it, but interleukin 1, interleukin 6, also facilitate this process. Okay. And then I added there just my little cheeky sense of humour and every other pathology that you're likely to encounter. Yeah. Alright, so you probably guys are going to encounter lots of rheumatoid arthritis, osteoarthritis, ankylosing spondylitis, lupus, there's probably common ones. The hypercholesterolemia, heart disease, atherosclerosis, hypertension, diabetes mellitus, dementia. Yeah, these ones, there's a whole host of potential other ones that I'm sure that you're encountering in clinic, but I just thought I'd throw these in because, of course, most cases, people aren't coming to see an osteopath, I assume, for heart disease because they have hypertension. They're coming to see you for something else, but part of your case taking, that is a red flag to you. Yeah, it's something that you need to be aware of. I thought I'd throw this in. Again, I promise you that I'm not going to do loads of these flow charts and whatnot, although flow charts are kind of like my porn. I tease my students all the time, they excite me terribly. But I thought I'd just show you a couple of bits here that we're going to approach in terms of looking at nutrition, looking at herbs, looking at homeopathy, and the different angles that we're going to approach inflammation. So at the very top here, we have our inflammatory cytokines. So I said to you we're going to talk about interleukin 1, interleukin 6, and TNF. Not both of them, but all three of them promote inflammation. And we know that the inflammatory pathway in terms of promoting is all about vasodilations, increasing vascular permeability, and so we get edema in the local tissue. But when I'm talking about low-grade chronic inflammation. This is not edema that we see like we have pitting edema. Yeah? So it's not remarkable to us. We're not going to know that they have edema. They may have put on a little bit of weight over the years, right? So when we have a local edema, what does happen, however, is within the tissue spaces, within the extracellular chambers, we're going to have slight compression then of our vasculature. And as we have very slight compression of vasculature, so we're going to reduce the blood supply to those tissues. And in a response to that, so we have our states of hypoxia, response to that is the mitochondria become stressed, because their function is to take oxygen and hopefully make some ATP. Yes? So when we look at the states of hypoxia, we then start looking at mitochondrial dysfunction. And again, this is a huge topic too. I mean, there's conferences that are just based on mitochondrial dysfunction for a variety of reasons. I'm only talking about a state of hypoxia here, but they're looking at mitochondrial dysfunction linked to antibiotic use. So this is also something that we need to kind of query with patients. Have they taken antibiotics? How many have they taken? From what age? Yeah. In some countries, babies are put onto intravenous antibiotics the first day that they're born as a prophylactic, just in case they pick up a bacterial infection in hospital. So, you know, they already have a sterile environment, and whatever they've been colonized with in the first 24 hours is totally eradicated. So what impact is that having on their mitochondrial function? And I'm sure you're probably aware mitochondria, we know, derive from prokaryote cells, they're bacterium. Yeah, so we know that they are remnants of bacterial cells. So if an antibiotic is designed to disrupt a bacterial cell, well, what impact is that having on mitochondrial structure and their function? So it's really interesting. In this realm, we're going to talk about with mitochondrial dysfunction, how that then drives our inability to manufacture ATP. And the reason why this is important is because, of course, many of our immune cells require ATP to move. They require ATP to make the interleukins. They require ATP to mobilize themselves within the body. So if we have mitochondrial dysfunction, we have a massive knock-on effect in terms of immune function. If we don't mobilize, I just want you to try and appreciate, if we don't mobilize cells, the body has to think of another way. What is the next thing I can do? If I can't get cells to the area, what else can I do to stop this potential invader, to stop this potential threat? Well, let's produce massive amounts of pro-inflammatory cytokines. Hopefully, something will respond. Are you with me? Okay. So reduction of ATP synthesis. As a result also of the reduction of ATP synthesis, we tend to then have a congestion or accumulation of calcium ions. Now we know we need calcium for muscular contraction, and in this situation we're focusing on particularly with the skeletal muscle, but think of the nervous system. We know we need calcium also for neuronal impulses. Yeah. So when we have an accumulation of calcium in the cytosol, rather than kind of influxing and effluxing in and out of the cells, they're staying in one area. And this is hugely disrupting our balance, yeah, our gradient potential. And so as a result of this, we got the phospholipase activation, and as a result of that, the free radical formation. So obviously there's lots of pathways, there's lots of bits coming in, so I've kind of simplified it for you. But this is one aspect of how then free radical formation, yeah, free reactive oxygen species then are driving more cytokine production, which is then driving this pathway even further. Okay, and it's again a self-perpetuating, potentially low grade, maybe not always low grade. Maybe the patient may be presenting with pain. Yeah. The other aspect of with the local edema, we've got direct and indirect pressure on, of course, our sensory neurons. So nerves are locally, which is going to be causing pain. And obviously the topic of allodynia comes in quite a lot when we start talking about, particularly with these pathways, is pain perception, inappropriate pain perception, and exaggerated pain perception. In terms of obstacles in clinic, I thought I'd throw this in because, of course, we're going to talk about nutrition and herbs and homeopathy, and it's always one of these, I'll chat about a case later on, and I'm sure some of you go, well, why don't you give this, or why don't you give that? Well, because actually, when you're in clinic, you need to take the individual into account. You can't give them 20 different supplements to take and hope for the best. Yeah? Hopefully they'll maybe try 2 of them. So you need to take a couple of factors into account. First one is their willingness to change. I think, you know, it sounds an obvious one. Many patients coming to you may want to just be maybe tweaked, massaged, yeah, palpated a little bit, but they don't actually want to have a change in their diet. They don't actually want to make an effort. They want someone else to take the responsibility, and you're the one responsible now because you've got to do the touching, right? So I think that's the first hurdle to encounter is the willingness to change. The next one is, yes, let's approach diet. But obviously with diet comes also finances. Yeah. Unfortunately, the sad thing is, in many cases, to eat healthy tends to be the more expensive produce, right? And I'm not one of these, I don't promote, everyone's gluten-free, everyone's dairy-free, everyone must eat organic. I don't think that's always the case. I don't think it's always required, right? Organic doesn't always necessarily mean it's better for you. Okay, the next one is stress. So this is looking at family stresses. Yeah. Sometimes it's also perceived stress. Yeah. I've got a lovely case, an example of a woman who had lupus. And quite a bad case of lupus. Unfortunately, it started affecting her nervous system, so she would seizure quite frequently. And just to give an example, to take a case that would normally take maybe 20 minutes, it would take me 2 hours to take the case from her because she would seizure pretty much every 4 to 5 minutes. And so we'd have a seizure, and then we'd have to kind of recoup and orientate her, introduce myself again to her. So this whole process would take quite some time to get anywhere. And with her, there was lots of kind of potential abuse. And it got to a point where, with lupus, there's also a degree of psychosis as the pathology progresses. Yes, you see a lot of kind of skeletal stuff going on and cardiovascular stuff going on, but the neurological side is massive, is huge, yeah? And lots of psychosis, and she had auditory hallucinations. And as the homeopath, I was, maybe not as a homeopath, as being nosy myself, I was questioning, was this really a reality for her? Was she really abused? Was the abuse the kind of trigger that started this autoimmunity? And then I kind of stepped out of it and thought, well, hang on, it actually doesn't matter whether it did happen or not. It's about her perception. Yeah. So when it comes to stresses, it's important to just again remind yourself. If you've got 2 kiddies or 3 kiddies and you're running around, you're stressed, and you're still managing to work and you're still managing to do this, and someone comes in to see you and they're saying, well, I've got 1 kid but I can't cope with them because they're just too hectic, and you go, well, I've got 3 and I manage, so I think you can manage too. That's not really enough. It's about their perception, their experience, and their response to that. You with me? So, in terms of the stressor, we're looking at lifestyle, we're looking at exercise is a huge one too. Yeah? Just because you're working out at the gym for 3 hours every day doesn't mean you're healthy. Okay. If anything, I'm anti-running. I'm just going to put that out there. I'm anti-running, I'm all for walking. Incline walking, actually. And then finances. So finances, going back to diets. Not just with diet, do they also have the finances for some of the supplements? Because some supplements can be quite costly. So when it comes to recommending what supplements they should try, it's again about trying to choose which supplements are most appropriate for them, which combinations work well. Look, I know you guys are not going to be nutritional therapists, you're not going to be prescribing loads of different complex supplements, but I'm hoping that when you leave, you've got a few little tidbits that you may be able to recommend. Yeah? And then obviously the autoimmunity aspect that will come to that too. Now I know you don't assess full blood tests, but have you guys encountered Genova? Because you can register with Genova, yeah? So I don't know if perhaps maybe you don't run blood tests because you don't feel confident, maybe because your background wasn't in doing blood tests, but places like labs like Genova, like BioLab, they will quite happily take on an osteopath. So there are certain profiles which I'll mention which may be useful for you to start kind of maybe looking into. What's also quite nice is that they have a practitioner support. So when you run a profile, you call them up and they'll explain it to you. So if you're still quite new to the realm of kind of sending for tests, use them. Kind of broaden your horizons, in terms of how you assess patients. They're also fantastic tools to monitor whatever you're doing. So you've got a kind of starting block when you first see them. 6 months down the line, 8 months down the line, has your protocol, has your treatment, your osteopathic treatment helped? Has perhaps some of the supplements or herbs or dietary changes that you're looking at, has that also made a difference, right? We should have some kind of tool other than the patient just going, yeah, I'm feeling good. Okay. Well, I like to have a tool. So I'm going to say you must have a tool too. Okay. When we look at full blood counts, so full blood counts, FPCs. This is obviously a standard, but BioLab can do this for you too. Your ESR and CRP. I'm sure you're well familiar with these. Your very kind of typical inflammatory markers. Remember, CRP also gives us an indication too of of heart disease risk. If you treat any oncology patients, you're likely to see these being raised quite frequently, particularly if they're undergoing chemo and radiation. So it's one to kind of keep a very close eye on. There's a fantastic supplement that I came across just by a fluke, really, just experimenting, that brings down CRP really well, so I'll chat to you about that one. The HbA1c, so this is your glycated hemoglobin, so it's looking at kind of checking glucose levels. So is the patient monitoring or managing their glucose effectively? So if you have any diabetic patients, this should be something that they're doing on a regular basis, every 6 months. You know, apart from their kidney function tests, apart from their retinal checks, they need to be having consistent checks, yeah? And their doctors can do this. You don't have to, you know, send for it privately. The doctors should be doing it every 6 months anyway. All right, blood insulin. I wanted to mention blood insulin because it's not something that's ever spoken about. We normally talk about with glucose and diabetes. We talk about checking random glucose or fasting glucose and the HbA1c. But fasting insulin is one that's going to pick up if someone is pre-diabetic. And that's really where we want to hop on and make a difference, right? We don't want to wait until they're diabetic. So checking for insulin levels is, if anything, more important, really, when you look at someone who is suffering from pain or if there's a degree of depression. Looking at their diet, I think you are in good stead by having a look at their insulin levels, particularly if they're in their 40s. Yeah, because normally if you're pre-diabetic, within about 10 years you will be diabetic. Yeah, you're not going to stay pre-diabetic forever. Yeah, it will progress in time as the insulin resistance builds. So check blood insulin. GPs don't do this, so your NHS doctor's not going to do this. So the patient's not going to be able to walk and go, please can you do my blood insulin levels? They're going to look at you like, what? Why do you want that? So it's a different, unique, special test, but again, not very expensive. It's probably about £35. Okay. The autoimmune profile, of course, is handy, not from a diagnostic perspective in terms of diagnosing the patient, because in most cases they're coming to you telling you they've got lupus or they've got RA. But I think it's quite, again, useful as a tool to monitor or manage the patient. Check, is your protocol working effectively? Okay. And then stool analysis. I'm going to chat to you about probiotics and particularly about the flora, the gut flora. This becomes important when you start looking at another alternative way of looking at inflammation. There's massive amounts of research looking at how things like gut dysbiosis, these are all hot terms, by the way, for nutrition, gut dysbiosis, SIBO. Have you guys encountered the SIBO talk? Yeah? Nutritional therapists, honestly. And then obviously leaky gut, which is a big one. And obviously all three of those are totally dismissed by mainstream medicine. They have no acknowledgement of these three conditions. Okay, so we'll touch on that. But yeah, with the stool analysis, calprotectin is something also that you guys could do. It's a stool test, and this gives a good indication of any kind of gut inflammation. So if you've got someone who's got Crohn's, but they've got joint pain as well, it's a way to kind of also manage and check. Most likely, as their Crohn's is flaring up, also their joint pain will also flare up too at the same time. So it could be an alternative means of inflammation assessment. Steatorrhea, parasites and ova. Steatorrhea is also another one when the liver is not coping with much of the interleukins that are being produced. When we have high interleukin 1 and interleukin 6, this increases your LDL production. And if there's any inflammation in the gut, like if they have dysbiosis or they have SIBO, they most likely are not absorbing their nutrition very well. So they will get fatty stools. That's your steatorrhea. Adrenal profile. I'm going to talk to you about this one because I think it's a useful one for you guys to get into, and hopefully maybe just run it on yourself and see what comes up. But the adrenal stress profile is a saliva sample, so it's non-invasive. You spit into a tube and you post it away, so you don't have to leave your front door, right? So it's quite convenient for patients too. But this gives you a good indication of your cortisol levels through the day. You know, standard GP will check for cortisol first thing in the morning. And if you fit within your parameters, then you're all hunky-dory. But what happens through the course of the day? Are you following the natural rhythm of cortisol production through the day? So this is also quite useful for us. Of course, the more information an individual has, the more inappropriate their cortisol responses are going to be. And obviously, the more stress we have, the more cortisol we're likely to produce. We're going to see also a drop in the secretory IgA. I'm sure you're all familiar with secretory IgA. This is, secretory IgA is lining all the mucosa, so it's a mucosal antibody. We're going to find it in your tears and saliva, throughout the whole digestive tract, throughout the respiratory airways, and it's kind of like, you liken it to like an antibacterial paint that you kind of paint on the inner lining of your digestive tract, but plays a fundamental role at kind of tagging any foreign antigens for us. And when that level drops, it means that we have an inappropriate kind of immune response. We aren't really checking good flora, bad flora. Okay, and so this is how stress can impact on our gut ecology. Okay, it's a very simplified view. The organic acid profile, this can be useful particularly when assessing the mitochondrial function. They're using it a lot also with individuals with learning difficulties. Generally what it is, the organic acids are waste products or markers that are released as a result of a variety of metabolic processes in the body. So by looking at the organic acids, any that are slightly raised or too low can give an indication of certain pathways that aren't being fulfilled properly. In other words, they're being incomplete. Yeah, they're not running through entirely. And this can a lot to do with various cofactors. If we're lacking certain cofactors, we don't complete the pathway. So these kind of highlight any issues within that. They're using organic acid testing a lot with children, particularly with, on the autistic spectrum, and they're finding huge fluctuations within these organic acid profiles. And then lastly, the allergy and intolerance testing. Again, something that you could do. Loads of people want to do allergy and intolerance testing. And I'll never forget a patient who had seen a chiropractor, a physio, and an osteopath over a 2.5-year period for lower back pain. And he was a builder, right? So you kind of go, he's a builder, it must be occupational, let's, do our thing, blah, blah, blah. And no one helped. He then encountered a friend who said, well, maybe you've got a gluten intolerance, because, as everyone does, if you've got a bit of a stomach issue or whatever, it must be gluten. So he removed gluten, not really much of an improvement. Now, he had hay fever. He was an individual who suffered from hay fever quite extensively. So already I thought, well, I wonder if there's a kind of an allergic or perhaps an intolerance constitution in him. So we ran a food profile. I wasn't really expecting to kind of observe anything significant, but what did come back was apricots, right? So that's, and massive, like through the charts, apricots. And I'm like, well, what's up with apricots? So he came to the consult. He was also a rugby player, by the way. He's massive, over 6 foot. Said, so, your profile came back, nothing really remarkable other than apricots. And he was like, well, I don't know why you got apricots, I don't eat apricots. And thankfully his wife was on the consult with him and said, well, actually, you drink apricot juice every morning. And he was like, oh yeah, I do, I forgot about that apricot juice. So I said, well, do me a favour, let's just stop the apricot juice and see how your hay fever manages. Because at this point we weren't quite knowing what to do with the low back pain. And within 3 days the back pain was gone. So he'd had this low back pain for 2.5 years with no improvement. Just a removal of apricot juice from his diet. Within 3 days, low back pain gone. Why? Because of the proximity of the colon, and particularly the ileum. And that whole kind of lumbar region. And so the more inflammation that he had within the walls of the intestine, well, this is obviously being referred to, you guys probably know it better than I do, being referred to that lower lumbar region, which I thought was quite interesting. Alright, with stress and chronic inflammation, researchers completed genome-wide analysis of the immune cells taken from the stress mouse's blood. They found that compared with the non-stress mouse, 3,000 genes in the stress mouse immune cells were either expressed at higher or lower levels, and 1,142 of the upregulated genes played a role in making the immune cells become more inflammatory. So in other words, this is just linking, when the more stressed we are, the more we upregulate genes to promote inflammation. And so the reason why I popped that in there, because I wanted you to appreciate too, perhaps you may have a patient who actually, they will say, well, nothing really is stressful in my life. However, they are showing signs that there is a stress factor going on. And so often when you ask questions like, what were your parents' background? What was, if they're young enough to know their parents, and they how was their mother's pregnancy? When mum was pregnant with them, was there any traumatic event? Grief, loss. Prior to that, look how many world wars and wars that people have had to endure. We've gone through World War I, World War II, and how many civil wars, particularly within Europe. So these stressor events, how is that having a knock-on effect with offspring? It wouldn't make sense from a survival of a species. It wouldn't make sense if offspring were being born unable to cope with stress. So the more stresses we've had through history, the more the offspring are in an attempt to adapt to stresses. And how? By upregulating pro-inflammatory markers, by upregulating their ability to then respond. It's kind of like, again, in countries when they fight lots of wars, and maybe they don't have a war for 50 years, but it doesn't matter, they'll make sure they have a good army. You with me? So it's kind of like the body's way of going, well, I know there's no stressor at the moment, but I'm going to make sure that my offspring has a good army, so that if it does encounter a stressor, it knows exactly what to do. In terms of the IgA, this is just reflecting on how stress, when we're stressed, when we have high cortisol levels, and other kinds of ACH drivers, we have a dip or decline in secretory IgA. And secretory IgA's role, when you have a look here, it plays a very important role in terms of regulating gut flora. So just in terms of kind of stabilizing the gut ecology, has a fundamental role here. So we can kind of already directly see a link between stress and disruption to gut ecology. In addition to that, when we look at regulating bacterial colonization, it also contributes to the integrity of the mucosa. So when I talk about things like leaky gut a little bit later on, and also in other pathologies like in Crohn's or ulcerative colitis, or when we look at celiacs, which I'm sure you're encountering lots of, how does secretory IgA help with kind of managing these patients and managing their internal environment? All right, so in terms of assessing adrenal function, Genova's got a really lovely comprehensive stress profile test, which I thought I would show you. Oh, it's going to take you right back to the beginning. And what's quite lovely is with Genova, when they do give you a profile, they also give you a bit of a description, so have an interpretation of whatever they're seeing in the results. So even if this is totally foreign to you, it's pretty self-explanatory. Yeah. And of course, obviously, once you get more familiar with it, you don't really need to then read the info. All right, so generally what they will do is, once you've registered with them, you get your little practitioner code, and you can give that practitioner code to your patient. They can order the sample from them directly, or you can order it and give your patient the little bag with the vial. And they collect you're supposed to collect 4 saliva samples at different times of the day. So you get a morning, just before lunchtime, late afternoon, and just before bed. So the idea of this, again, is looking at the cortisol fluctuations. It's really by about 4 o'clock, you should start seeing a decline. Yeah, it's at its highest around about 11 o'clock in the morning. So when you're having a look at this, post-waking, this individual's like off the roof. Yeah, they're totally off the charts. However, it drops or declines pretty steadily. It's still within norms, it's still within norms, it's still within norms. This one is quite a nice one because it's not, sometimes you get ones that are rock bottom over here and then fluctuates and hits rock bottom again. So it really just depends on the individual, but depending on where it's spiking and where it's hitting rock bottom, this gives us an indication of, is this stress an acute stressor? Is it a chronic stressor? What is the state of the adrenal function in this scenario? So this is quite handy to have a look at. But in addition to that, I wanted to just draw your attention to the DHEA. So they also check for DHEA. And we know DHEA is the precursor to not only cortisol, but also things like aldosterone, but also things like testosterone, estrogen, progesterone. And so all of these hormones, our sex hormones, as well as things like aldosterone that regulates blood pressure, we can see how stress kind of feeds into all of these pathways. Cortisol promotes things like lipolysis. It breaks down fat to increase blood glucose levels, right? When we have stress, why do we likely develop diabetes? Well, because of this pathway of driving high glucose levels. Anyway, I'm sure you're familiar with most of these anyway if you have a look back at DHEA. But remember, DHEA and cortisol are linked to each other because DHEA makes the cortisol. You often find that when people are driving excessive cortisol production, their DHEA will drop. It's a kind of, again, if you're making loads of chocolate cake and you keep using all your chocolate to make the chocolate cake, well, you're not going to have anything left in the cupboard. You're using the raw material all the time. You're kind of driving this excessive cortisol production. So your DHEA declines, and what happens then is we then lack the raw material to make things like testosterone, progesterone, estrogen. So we start seeing a hormonal disruption, a sex hormonal disruption. And this is where things like fertility start coming into play. The other one here that I want to draw your attention to too is the IgA. So checking for secretory IgA. Because remember I said to you, generally speaking, their IgA is fine. And because it's slightly on the kind of upper side, you may want to investigate, obviously, things like food intolerances would be causing the secretory IgA to increase. If this person had low cortisol throughout, you would suspect that their IgA would probably be in normal range. If the secretory IgA was also very low and cortisol was very low, then this person's been chronically depleted for a long period of time. Yeah. So it's, again, there's quite a lot you can tell by looking at the test. You can kind of get a time scale as to how long the stress has been occurring and how well they've been coping. All right, and then at the bottom, I'm happy to send this through to you too, but if you go to Genova's website, there's loads of extra support materials that you can have a look at if you're interested in doing blood tests. But that's the kind of profile that they'll give to you for the patient. And it's quite nice. I think I'm all for kind of educating the patient too. It's quite nice to be able to give the patient something that they can then read. And very often Genova will then also recommend certain supplements. So they may say, okay, well, magnesium may be good for da-da-da-da-da, B6 may be good for da-da-da-da-da. So it's quite handy that the patient can see, you know, via the blood test, this is actually what I need to support myself. Yeah. All right, so we're going to chat about the microbiome, so our little tiny little environment within the lumen of our digestive tract. So remember, guys, our lumen is still very much a part of our external environment. And so when we have a look at the kinds of things that we're eating, the types of flora that we're going to find located within the digestive tract, it changes. Yeah, much like, you know, different places in the world have different environments. Well, the same thing with our gut. Our gut changes in terms of its environments. And so thus the bacteria within these different sections also equally change. Now, when we look at more than 100 trillion microorganisms, at least 1,800 genera and 40,000 species. So incredibly unique microecology, right? So for each one of us, we have our own unique little system going on. So when you go into a health food store, hopefully you go into health food stores. If not, go and have a browse. But when you go to a health food store, in most cases they're recommending things like Lactobacillus acidophilus, Bifidobacterium. Those are kind of the standards, right? There are new ones coming onto the market. But generally speaking, when you're just isolating one little microorganism, how is this really establishing our ecology when we have such a complex flora, yeah, such a complex system? But what's quite valuable about this microbiome is the whole kind of complexity and how they all work together, both the goodies and the baddies. They produce loads of antitoxins, so whatever toxins, exotoxins or endotoxins bacteria are producing that are colonizing the gut, they bind to them and that's to render them neutral, right? So that it plays an important role. Why do they do this? Not to benefit us. They couldn't really give a toss about us, right? But what they're doing is they're trying to ensure that they survive. So they're fighting their neighbors and ensuring their neighbors don't take hold, right? And this is why it's such a dynamic, beautiful little environment. It's a self-regulatory environment. Anti-inflammatory cytokines, again, they kind of release their own little fertilizer to ensure that they can survive, and we just happen to benefit as a result of it. So when we look at flora, particularly when we look at kind of gut inflammation, many of the flora that we have there are actually making or reducing the inflammation in the gut, making it more conducive to their growth, and we just happen to benefit from the process. Okay, so they're always quite handy. In terms of short-chain fatty acids, most of our kind of, particularly things like E. coli bacteria in the colon, they produce these short-chain fatty acids, and these are quite nutritive for the enterocytes themselves. So these short-chain fatty acids are not really fatty acids that are then circulated systemically, but they're used locally by the enterocytes. So again, it kind of feel to help kind of feed or encourage that kind of healing and repair process. Right, so we've got two things. We've got either the nutrition for the enterocytes, the energy, fuel for healing and repair, but also the anti-inflammatory nature of the probiotics. And why do we want to ensure that we have this good ecology? Well, remember, 70% of our immune system is located within the gut. And so if the gut is not functioning optimally, if something is being disrupted within the gut, that has a knock-on effect with our immune function. Okay. And remember also we've got things called like toll-like receptors. I don't know if you've encountered toll-like receptors, but these are tagging systems that identify things that are foreign to us. They identify bacteria particularly. And if these toll-like receptors are not working properly because they've been damaged, like when there's inflammation, like when we have food intolerances, well then we don't detect when flora are wrong and we don't know how to deal with them. Okay, so it's a kind of a bit of a vicious cycle. When we talk about the development of T regulatory cells, we know T regulatory cells have a huge role to play in kind of modulating the immune response. So driving the pro-inflammatory pathways, but then also allowing for kind of a pullback and an anti-inflammatory system when it's inappropriate. So these are your kind of modulatory T cells. Okay, so it helps facilitate them. And it becomes fundamentally important. You find, going back to the secretory IgA is probably at its highest production around about the ages of 7 to 10 years old. And then it slowly starts declining. And then obviously once we turn 30, it's pretty much all downhill from there. It starts massively declining. But during that 7 to 10 period, the idea here too is that by the age of 7 to 10, we really should be encountering all the different varieties of foods that we'll ever encounter. And we're being exposed to as many allergens or potential antigens, I know antigens, but antigens that we will ever encounter. So it's a kind of sensitization period. And so this is why we kind of invest in the IgAs, so that they can see what is foreign and what is part of us. And so when you look at the kind of age bracket, when there's a lot of kind of disruption in terms of diet, a lot of stresses going on in that child's life during that bracket, that has an impact potentially in terms of their immune function and possibly autoimmunity later on.